Hi and welcome to another episode of Fresh Thinking by Snowden Optiro. My name's Ian Glacken and I'm a executive consultant here in Perth, Western Australia. Today we're going to discuss what's probably quite a thorny and divisive topic in mineral resource estimation. And that topic is, should we be trying to minimise conditional bias in an estimate, or should we be striving for a better idea of the grade tonnage relationship at the time of mining? Because essentially these two objectives are mutually exclusive. So before we get into the topic, I'd like to introduce my esteemed guests. Firstly, we're joined by Graeme Lyall. Graeme's an executive consultant for Snowden Optiro based in our Santiago office, who's visiting us in Perth at the moment. Graeme's a very experienced mine geologist, resource geologist and exploration geologist who's worked all over the place. Secondly, we've got Dr Oscar Rondon, Don Oscar as he's known, and he's a principal geostatistician for Datamine. Oscar works here in Perth with the supervisor and the Isatis products and helps the consultants out with geostatistical advice and training. So welcome, gentlemen.
Yes, thank you again.
You're welcome.
Pleasure to be here with.
Thank you. So let me frame the issue, and then we'll get our experts to discuss this. Firstly, I just wanted to talk about conditional bias. Now, we've had lots of discussions on this, and I'm going to put it fairly simply. Conditional bias is let me explain what conditional bias means. Conditional in the sense that the bias is not the same. And we're talking about here the relationship between our estimated grades in a block model and the true grades. So conditional bias means that the bias, the degree of difference, if you like, between our estimated grades and the true grades is not the same depending on the grade or the cutoff grade. It varies. Now, the direction in which it varies is up for discussion, but we do have a varying a degree of bias. So this is different to, say, a bit of analytical equipment in an assay lab, where if it's not calibrated correctly, you might get a constant bias depending on what the grade range is. In this case, the bias is not constant, it's conditional, it varies, and this is an issue. So in the early days of geostatistics, when the fundamentals of kriging were being explored or developed by D.G Krige, they clearly noted a bias between the estimated grades in the panels underground in the South African gold mines and the true grades. So a consequence of that is this idea of misclassification, where we are predicting one grade and the grade is actually different to that. And of course, one of the issues with that is that we're sending ore to the waste dump and waste to the plant. So with respect to this idea of conditional bias, there's two and perhaps three schools of thought. The first idea, or the first school of thought, if you like, is that conditional bias should be avoided or minimised in all cases. And this is very much the thing put forward by Krige, and then also reinforced in a key paper by Van et al. In 2003. So, Oscar, what's the story here?
Yeah, the idea here, Ian, is that the first school of thought, as you said, believe that conditional bias is critical and it must be addressed, right? So it will have a negative impact and it should be handled. Yeah, that could be using, for instance, an adequate search routine to minimize conditional bias. And if not possible or impractical to change the search routine, simple kriging with local means could be used.
Okay, thanks. And so the second school of thought is that conditional bias is a necessary consequence of estimation and that we should keep it. The most famous, if you like, work in this area was the paper by Ed Isaacs called the Kriging oxymoron. And he presented this at a conference I was at in Banff in Canada way back when. And it was quite an interesting discussion because basically what Isaacs was saying was very contrary to what Krige was saying, and Krige was in the room, and so they had quite a discussion. And I would also note that there's been quite a bit of work by Deutsch in this area. So Graeme, what's the story here?
Oh yes, I guess that there is one paper by Noack and Luethong, which pretty much introduced their conclusions in the title. You know, it's titled Conditional Bias. Let's keep it. And then you've got the paper on, or the the paper by Isaacs, which the
Kriging
controversial
oxymoron.
paper.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly that. And he's basically telling us that we can't have the best of both worlds, and so you can't have estimates that are conditionally unbiased and at the same time provide an accurate prediction of the grades and tons above cutoff. And then you've got Deutsch, who basically spells it out in a couple of papers in more layman terms. He's very good at that. And I think all these people coincide that the approach required for long-term planning, where your drill spacing is very wide spaced, you're going to get a lot of smoothing, and that's going to be an issue if you use the traditional sort of large searches with lots of lots of samples.
Yep.
You're going to get a lot of smoothing, and you're not going to actually predict your grade tonnage. So if you take the NOAC approach to basically to counteract smoothing, they're saying that we should use much more restrictive searches. We should be using much less samples to reduce the smoothing. But in this way, you're going to introduce a sort of more inaccurate local prediction. You're going to have conditional bias, but basically that you can live with that.
Right, right.
It's the least of the two evils.
Right.
And their justification for this is that, you know, that at a long-term planning stage, your local accuracy is not a priority, and it's probably a bigger priority to have, you know, a better prediction of the grade and tons that you will be stating above that.
Right. And I guess one of the consequences of that is that when we do come to mine it, we're going to have a lot more data, and then conditional bias is not going to be an issue because we have an accurate prediction.
Yeah.
I guess it's important to mention, I didn't mention it before, that that's one of the main difference between the two school of thoughts. The first one handles or minimizes or try to control conditional bias, even if we have a short-term or a long-term model.
Yeah. So another issue is that this idea of the relationship between conditional bias and smoothing. So in other words, the more smoothing we have, the more conditional bias we're introducing. And if you do an AI search on conditional bias, this is the impression you'll get. So Oscar, what would you say about that? You know, this idea of conditional bias and smoothing.
Yeah, you can find a lot of information on the internet, and this one is put simply wrong. Okay, it's misinformation. We all know that if you increase the search, right, you can minimize conditional bias, but you will introduce a lot of smoothing.
So smoothing is a consequence of minimizing conditional bias.
Correct.
That's right. So I have to say, you know, we're sitting here in Perth, and I think from our experience, there is an industry, particularly in Australia, which is this idea of minimizing conditional bias. You know, and so we have this idea of KNA. KNA stands for Kriging neighborhood analysis, or quantitative Kriging neighborhood analysis, if you go with the Van description. Oscar, briefly, what is KNA?
Put simply, Ian, Kriging neighborhood analysis is a way to assess the impact of the different Kriging parameters that we use to run the estimate. For instance, we can analyze the impact of the search neighborhood or the minimum and maximum number of samples. And to do so, we use metrics like the Kriging efficiency and slope of regression.
Right. And that's what we would call KNA.
KNA.
So Graeme, part of this KNA process, I guess, is this idea of selecting a block size. Now, quite often that doesn't really work with KNA, and you know, what would be your approach to choosing an optimal block size for estimation?
I can say it's a very difficult question to answer. I guess in the ideal theoretical case, really you shouldn't be choosing a block size that is much smaller than your grid spacing. But this is totally impractical if you're considering, you know, that the mine planning requirements down the line. So on the other hand, I think that, you know, it's clear from my personal experience that you choose a block size that is smaller than, say, half or a quarter the the drill spacing, which is often you're choosing a block size that is smaller than the grid spacing. It doesn't really matter, how small your block size is. The smoothing is actually controlled by the grid size, and it's going to be the same. So in practical terms, I guess a common approach is to select a block size that is similar to your minimum selective mining unit. And in my view, it becomes more important to understand and quantify the smoothing that will happen. And you can actually do this using theoretical approaches,
which we'll talk about in a second.
And also understand the impact that the smoothing may have on your downstream processes, like dimensioning on your financial analysis, on dimensioning processing capacity or your mine waste.
Right. So what you're saying, Graeme, is this idea of choosing a larger block size to minimise conditional bias is not necessarily the right thing to do. And I would point out that obviously there's practitioners on both sides.
Yeah, KNA is just going to drive you towards a larger and larger block size, which is not practical.
Yeah. Okay. No, fair enough. So Oscar, this idea of selecting the correct grade tonnage curve is something that some people practice quite a lot. How would we do that? What are the techniques for deriving let's say a global grade tonnage curve from the sample data?
Correct. So one way is to use a theoretical approach, for instance, the Discrete Gaussian method, to generate a grade tonnage curve at a given block size, right? So then we can adjust the kriging parameters so the kriging estimate aligns, or the grade tonnage curve aligns with the theoretical one. That's another way of matching the grade tonnage curve.
Right.
Yeah.
So Graeme, what would you say to that? That obviously is a practice, and you've seen it. How closely would you adhere to that idea of manipulating the estimate to achieve the correct grade tonnage curve?
Well, yeah, I think everything's got its risks. So an approach that uses more restricted searches to provide a better estimate of recoverable resources, it may be defendable for long-term planning, but as I said, that there are certain risks involved, and you should always be checking your block grade tonnage predictions against the theoretical approaches. And if you go overboard, if you don't do it correctly, and you use too few samples, you may be over-optimistic on grades and tons above cutoff. And that's when you actually run into things that could end up in being a fatal flaw. Okay. But also, I guess that approach of trying to adjust things to the grade tonnage curve also has, you're probably going to still have smoothing in your estimate, but it's a different sort of smoothing. You might correct the grade tonnage curve, but you've still got a problem with what you call spatial smoothing. Mm-hmm. Your high grades are going to be better connected. You're probably going to overstate continuity, and that could give a false indication to your mine planning.
Okay. So, Oscar, what would you say about this approach, this idea of essentially manipulating or calibrating the estimate to fix a predetermined grade tonnage curve?
Yeah, look, I usually say, and it's another technique there, practitioners, as Graham mentioned, needs to be aware of the pros and cons of the different techniques. And I usually say that the real validation is reconciliation, right? That's what I suggest to practitioners. So be aware of the different techniques, the pros and cons, and if you can validate the results with reconciliation, that's a real proof.
Okay, so what we've tried to present to you in hopefully a fairly objective way is essentially two different approaches to estimation. I have to say that where we're sitting in Australia, one approach is very much more common than the other. You know which one it is. And then other parts of the world, the other approach is more common. But I think, as Oscar said and Graeme said, I think you need to have your eyes open. You need to be aware of what the purpose of the model is. Is it a long-term model? Is it a short-term model? And I think you need to choose your poison, if you like, and proceed appropriately. I think it's important if you're interested in this topic, and as a resource estimator you should be, because it's one of the fundamental issues in resource estimation. I think it's important to read some papers on both sides. So the papers we would recommend, and we'll put them in the notes, is Krige's paper from 1996, Van's paper from 2003, Isaac's famous paper from 2005, ignore the maths, Deutsch's paper from 2007, and Novak and Liang Thong from 2017. There's 5 papers there. I think it's very, very much worth reading all of those and forming your own opinion. But I think the main point is, don't slavishly follow one or the other, and have your wits about you when you're doing it. So thank you for listening and sticking with us through what is quite a complex issue, and you can see there's more than one point of view here. If you enjoyed the podcast, please hit the subscribe button, and remember you can find the podcast where all good podcasts are found. Thank you.